So I'm aware that we're all going to have our own stories. So for me, my story really began through the Great Commission. I think the way I first met Jesus was definitely through the Great Commission of go and make disciples. I grew up in a wonderful and fantastic family. I grew up in Israel. My first language was Hebrew. And then I was in West Africa, in Ghana. I knew that I'd have a response here. Yes. God's own people. And then I came back to the UK when I was a teenager, or came to the UK. I'd never lived in the UK as a teenager, about 16, 17 years old. Wonderful, fantastic and brilliant family, but not a Christian family. Never went to church, never knowingly knew anybody who was a Christian, couldn't have told you the stories about Jesus. I would have managed Christmas, but Easter was a foreign story to me in any way, shape or form. And I was 21 years old in the British military. I was an early officer training for what's called the Royal Marines. And I met a guy called Paul, and Paul was a fantastic and great guy. He was a year or so ahead of me in the training package. He was a wonderful bloke. I got on with him extraordinarily well. And he was also a Christian. It was the first time I'd knowingly met someone who was a Christian. And I found the way he lived profoundly attractive. And it wasn't actually him who told me about Jesus, but it was because of him I listened when someone did. Wow. And someone gave me a Bible, and Jesus just walked off the pages of Scripture and radically transformed my life as a 21-year-old. So we all have different stories, but for me, I first encountered Jesus through the Great Commission, go and make disciples. But then I very quickly encountered Jesus through the Great Commandment, love one another. A little band of 6 or 7 of lads all became Christians at about the same time, and 25 years later we are still in contact, encouraging each other and urging each other to follow Jesus as best we possibly could. And I've discovered time and time again that church's capacity to embrace and love and make space is remarkable. I think of myself as that 21-year-old Royal Marine, and it amazes me that I was welcomed into church. In fact, the first time I went to church, I'll be honest, as a little aside, I asked a beautiful young lady out for a date. She said no, there'd be a man more important in her life than I could ever be, and his name was Jesus. And the only date I could take her on is if I took her to church. So the first time I turned up in church, I was the best dressed individual in church, so I thought I was on a date. I'd never been to church before. Midway through the sermon, I had no idea what was going on. The only kind of place I'd been where there was an individual at the front speaking in a monologue was lectures. So I started to put my hand up to ask a question in the middle of the talk. I'm like this, I was ignored, so I'm giving it like this. Now I realise in hindsight it was something of a charismatic church. So I stand there doing this, wasn't having much of a response. But I met Jesus through the Great Commandment. Love one another, this amazing ability to connect with each other and have meaningful relationships. And then I met Jesus through the great confidence. I will build my church. As first I began to work in ministry amongst professional sports people in the UK, helping them meet Jesus and develop churches that worked for people who could never walk into any public space without being mobbed. So what does church look like for them, those famous names? And then 10 years in China. Evangelism, church planting, trying to release the indigenous movement. I met the Jesus who says, be confident, I will build my church. And really, friends, that trio of greats is what we are seeking to do through a community of God's people on the ground, a local church, isn't it? We're seeking to be a people who are on mission, who are bound by community and are devoted to Jesus, the Great Commission. A people who are saying, yeah, I will go and make disciples. Yes, I will love one another. And yes, Jesus will build his church, and he's going to use me to do that. And whether your church is a meeting in a front room, we now lead a church called Lydia House, very similar to Phil's model. 5 or 6 or 8 now around the country, meeting in front rooms, meeting in coffee shops. Whether your church meets in a cathedral, whether your church has a planting date of 12/15, I love that, or whether a planting date of October. Wasn't it fantastic to hear the launch moment of 2 churches separated by over 1,000 years? I mean, wasn't that just amazing, yeah? Whether your church is tens or hundreds or thousands, this is what we're trying to be, isn't it? A community that is on Jesus' mission, loving each other and devoted to him, the 3 greats. But then I met Jesus through the great collaboration. I began to ask the question, What does it mean to see a whole region or area or city or borough or nation reached? Not simply starting individual churches in just the places and in just the ways that they are needed, but what does it mean to work together to see actually a whole wave of an advancement of Jesus' kingdom happening? Not just one adding one or one adding two, but tens adding hundreds and hundreds adding thousands. You see the difference? And so I started to work for the Baptist Union of Great Britain, trying to serve the 1,800 churches that make up that 400-year-old network, to say, what does it mean to rediscover our planting roots significantly? And we founded a centre, the St Hills Centre for Church Planting, working ecumenically to say, actually, how do we not only train pastors and teachers who are so necessary, but how do we train evangelists and apostles and church planters that are so needed in the economy? And that's when I started to meet Jesus in the great collaboration. Would you be one so the world would know that God sent me? Would you be united not because that is easy or harmonious or pleasant, because it's actually very difficult to be one, but would you be one for the greater cause that the world would know that God sent Jesus? It's a missionary command, our unity. And do you see the scale change? That the world would know. Not just your neighbour, or not just the 20 people who you saw baptised in your church, as beautiful as wonderful as it is, but the world, the region, the borough, the network. So this amazing question you've invited me to wrestle with, Phil's invited me to wrestle with, and Lincoln, I think is a fantastic question, right? What might God do so that it became a multiplying ecosystem rather than just a collection of churches? And it's beautiful to be a collection of churches, particularly a collection of churches in friendship. That is wonderful, but that is not the John 17 unity Jesus is talking about. He's not talking about a unity which means you can sit together in a room over breakfast. He's talking about a unity that produces the momentum that the world of Southwark would know that God sent Jesus. We exist, our unity doesn't exist to make this pleasant space. Our unity exists is to make that space reach the very good news of Jesus. Yeah. So let me offer some thoughts from the book of Acts, and I think the book of Acts helps us with this idea of what does multiplication look like. The book of Acts, commentators are agreed from all the different tribes and streams and thinking. The book of Acts is split into three sections, three units. The first unit, chapters 1 to 10, is often called the Jerusalem period, after one of the major churches that is there. The second section, 11 to 20, is often called the Antioch period, after one of the major churches there. And then the last section, 21 to 28, is often called the Ephesian church, after one of the major churches there. And each of those three sections has different emphasis, different pacing, different way of writing. It's meant to be seen as three distinct episodes, three lenses to see the same thing. And one of the things it's showing us is, how does God start new churches at scale? How is God at work doing multiplication through the starting of new churches? And one of the ways we see that is through the uneven distribution of words. So in the first portion of Acts, Acts chapters 1 to 10, the Jerusalem period, there's a disproportionate use of the word scattered. 96%, which is all but one, of the uses of the word or concept of scattered in the entire book of Acts appear in chapters 1 to 10. That through the movement of people, God reaches new people and starts new churches. Sometimes that movement is through plan, such as the end of Pentecost. They always planned to go back home, didn't they? But they didn't plan to go back home with Jesus. And sometimes it's through pain, such as after the martyrdom of Stephen, through fear and persecution, they have to move. Now, one of the sections that talks about the word of scattered actually is in Acts chapter 11, 19 to 20. It's kind of recording back what happened in that section. Have a look at what it says. Now, those who had been scattered, see the word, by the persecution that broke out when Stephen was killed, travelled as far as Cyprus and Antioch, spreading the word only among the Jews. Some of them, however, men from Cyprus and Cyrene went to a different Antioch, and began to speak to Greeks also, telling them the good news about the Lord Jesus. The Lord's hand was with them, and a great number of people believed and turned to the Lord. Do you see how God uses the movement of people to start new churches, whether through plan or through pain? Now we see the echoes of that today in what's often called migration and mobility. Mobility is the movement of people around a nation, within a nation. Migration is the movement of people into a nation or into an area. Super interesting to me that of the four groupings that Phil identified, and so that 3 of the 4 were about movement of people. Yeah, in some way, shape or other. Whether through pain or pain, whether through economic opportunity of education or career, or whether through the pain of asylum seeking, there's people constantly moving in and moving out. So what does it look like to play your part in catalysing multiplication of new churches through that movement of people? How do you make that happen? One of the observations I've got is individual churches and networks like this room are fantastic at being brilliant landing pads, but need to work much harder to be fantastic launching pads. What does it mean to really help students who arrive at any number of your universities to land brilliantly well? Of course you want to do that, but are you spending as much time and attention saying we have to launch them fantastically, to start new churches in their front rooms, in their digs, in their halls of residence? Not just help them to be comfortable as Christians, but actually send them as missionaries. You've got 3 years to do it, which means you've got 6 months to get them doing it, so they can use 2 of their years well. Yeah? Or what about asylum seekers or migrants coming into the area? Work brilliantly hard to say, what does a landing pad, how do we soften their landing? Absolutely, I don't want to be misheard here, but are we as equally quick to say, how do we launch? How do we empower? How do we enable people not like us in any way, shape or form, without our knowledge or competence of the area, who we're not sure will do a brilliant job, but God has sent them, so we trust God more than we trust ourselves. You see the difference?
Yeah.
And we launch them. Now the middle section of Acts, the language changes again. There's no more use of the word scattered in the middle section of Acts. Acts chapters 10 to 20. Now the language or concept is of sent. 70% of the uses of the idea of being sent or going are found in this middle section. It's intentional by Luke. The strategy totally changes. All of a sudden, the middle section of Acts is God starts new churches through the intentional, strategic, resource mobilizing of a few strategic churches who are going to do more than most on this. Now, one of the examples of this, and one of the most well-known, but not the only one, is the Antioch church. Have a look at the language. While they were worshipping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I've called them." So after they'd fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on them and sent them off. And the 2 of them, sent on their way by the Holy Spirit, went down and off they went on their first church planting journey. Now, we see models adjacent to this nowadays in things which are often called resource churches or partner churches or city churches or network churches or releasing churches. Different streams and denominations have different names to describe the same thing. The identification of a relatively small number of churches that, because of their location or their size or their leadership, have disproportional opportunity to invest in church planting and leaders, and are going to send disproportionately more people to start new churches in strategic places than your average church would. There's no such thing as an average church, but you understand what I mean here. I think from my experience, about 10% of churches in any network, whether it's a denominational institutional network like the Baptists or the Anglicans or Elam, or whether it's a relational network like this one, about 10% have this responsibility. Now the absolute key thing here is if you are asking those relatively few churches to over-invest in the network needs to over-invest in them. Because that's what it means to be a family working together. If you're inviting a few churches, placing an expectation on a few churches to overreach themselves for the sake of church planting, the networks they're part of need to overinvest in them to make that happen. So in the Anglican world, this is the resource church mechanism. In the Baptist world that I'm most familiar with and oversee, it's called the partner church. We have recently in the Baptist world allocated 90% of our mission funds to go to 10% of our churches. Wow. And it will go to the 10% of our churches which are biggest and already well resourced. That seems countercultural, doesn't it? But actually what it is saying, let's embrace this model. Alongside the scattered, what does it mean to really resource these churches who then over-resource the network? And how do we seriously help them to do that well? And then third and finally in Acts, as we think about multiplication and how this room can release not just a few churches starting a few churches, but dozens of churches starting hundreds of churches, and hundreds of churches starting thousands of churches. The third section of Acts, the language changes again. So no longer is there language of scattered, that's reserved for the first third. No longer is the language sent in the middle third. The language we meet at the end of Acts is stay. All of a sudden, Paul's strategy seems to radically and totally change. I don't know if you notice this. Right the way through the book of Acts, up until chapter 20, Paul only stays in a place for a few weeks or a few months. He moves. And then all of a sudden, he stops moving. And the last third of Acts, he only goes to 3 places and spends years in each one. One of the examples of this is the church in Corinth in Acts 18, verse 11. So Paul stayed in Corinth for a year and a half, teaching the word of the Lord. Or another example would be here. In Acts 19, he took the disciples with him and had discussions daily in the lecture hall of Tyrannus. This went on for 2 years, so all the Jews and Greeks who lived in the province of Asia heard the word of the Lord. Do you see the irony of that? It's only when Paul stops moving the whole region hears. While Paul is constantly moving and acting like a serial church planter from the sent church, he reaches a city at best. Yeah? When he stops and stays and embeds, suddenly the whole region is reached. Now, I think this strategy is really important because there's a little bit of a lie that's been sold in multiplication and church planting, which is that you need to move often. And that lie is so great, we don't even realise it's a lie, and all of our training mechanisms do it. So in the Baptist world, and this is true in any world, but I'll point things at me as opposed to anyone else, but it's true of almost all your denominations, is when someone feels some kind of call to ministry, we train them with the intention of sending them. Why don't we train them with the intention of staying them? So they stay in one place and embed. And I think this model, the adjacent things we see today in this are the microchurch option. Stay somewhere long enough to build authentic, genuine relationships with people you're in proximity to, so you can invite them to your home to meet Jesus and meet each other and become those 3 greats, the mission, the community, and devotion. But you've got to be there long enough to build the relationships. Or the disciple-making movements, very adjacent to microchurches. Through your relational network. Don't go to a new place and start from scratch. Stay in the place you are and invite the relationships you already have to come and meet Jesus. You see it in things like proximal longevity, and I have entirely made up that phrase just for today, for your benefit. But by that I mean staying in one place for a long time with the same people. That is radically important in what's often called estates planting, where people live in one location. Their parents live there, their children will live there, they were born there, they will die there, and unless you have been there for that length of time as well, you'll be treated with suspicion. Welcome suspicion, but with suspicion. You're not truly one of us. What does it mean actually to celebrate the stayers in their unglamorous, gritty commitment of 35 years, who don't choose upward mobility, up and to the right, either career-wise or church-wise, but choose staying mobility? I will just remain here, even though my economic stability means I could move to a better place, greener pastures, better schools, but I won't, because by staying, the whole of Asia got reached. So let me pause for a moment, and I'm going to give you another 1-2 minutes just to have a buzz group, and then I've just got some final things to offer you. What I've tried to do initially is to think about this big question huge question that Phil's invited me to offer a thought experiment to you about, for you to wrestle and own and wonder about. What would it look like in essence that you guys move from a collection of churches in good relationship and enjoying each other's company to actually a multiplying ecosystem that says our great collaboration, our unity is not for the benefit of ourselves in a room like this, but our unity is so that they might know that God sent Jesus. It's a missional unity. I think a better English nowadays, a better translation of the Greek word we translate it to unity is momentum. That's actually more adjacent to what the original Greek word meant. We say unity, we think quite a stagnant, stationary thing. We're standing together, we often say. Actually, the Greek word is a soldier's word when a commanding officer says advance and you walk together. Yeah? Well, it's a movement word. So momentum, I think, is a better understanding for it. So Phil's asked me to help you think about that, particularly around church planting. I've offered you the thought that the Great Commission, the Great Commandment, and the Great Confidence is what makes a local church. Mission, community, devotion. But if you want to reach a region, you need the Great Collaboration. And I'm suggesting when it comes to church planting, we have a model in Acts. If you want to create church planting multiplication, you need to release the scattered model of migration and mobility. You need to release the sent model of resource churches and partner churches. And you need to release the stay model of people who root in, bed down, and reach their relational networks with the great good news of Jesus. If you had one question about how God would do this, what would that question be? Buzz that for 2 or 3 minutes. If you had one question about how God might do this, what would your question be? Turn to the person next to you and have a look, buzz them. Some thoughts came into my head about multiplication. I just want to share 3 things that I've learned about multiplication, because I had to learn it. I wasn't trained to do it, I wasn't helped to do it. My theological training, and I'll be honest, I'm very fortunate. I've got 2 bachelors, a master's, and a PhD. I'm happy to share them. But no one taught me how to lead multiplication. No one taught me. I've had to learn the hard way. Anyway, so let me offer these 3 thoughts. So they won't be crystal clear because they were literally, I was putting them together as I was sitting here thinking this might help as a thought experiment, right? So these are things I've learned. There's 3. Number 1, multiplication isn't addition done harder. That's how you kill healthy leadership and kill a church, actually. So multiplication is not doing the same things you did to grow by addition, but just doing them harder and faster. It's an entirely different mindset. In fact, I've learned there are certain growth models that are anti-multiplication. There are certain things we are taught to do to generate addition, which are actually anti-growth, anti-multiplication, I should say. So let me give you 2 examples. Number 1, if you're leading a traditional church, you're often told brilliant preaching is how you grow your congregation. So make sure you do most of it because you're the skilled preacher, and the church expects you to. If you're paid full time as a pastor and you start only preaching once a month, people will grumble and complain. What are you paid for? Yeah, won't it? Let's be honest, yeah? That is brilliant for addition growth. That is anti-multiplication. Because you say, to be able to do this, you have to be really good and you have to be me. What's pro-multiplication, as you start to move to church plant, is you do start only preaching once a month and you have different people doing it the other 3. The competence level goes up and the belief in people that they can do it goes through the roof. Yeah? It's the difference. Addition multiplication, if you want to grow by addition, which is good, you want people to walk in and go, wow, I could never do that. Wow, I've just met Jesus, I could never do it like that. That's why cathedrals can never multiply. Because you walk in and they're just a building. Wow, I could never do this. Yeah? But multiplication mindset means someone walks in and goes, wow, even I could do this. Yeah? That's why microchurches multiply so quickly in house churches. Because someone walks in and goes, wow, even I could do this. Yeah? They're built for multiplication. So that's the first thing. You've got to think about an entirely different mindset. What's the different mindset? I think it's the difference between competence being king and generosity being king. So in the addition model, competence really matters. Make sure everything done is really competent, yeah, and you'll grow by addition. But in the multiplication mindset, it's about generosity. Who can I give this away to? Who can I ask to have a go? Who's good enough for it to be okay? And you can start to multiply. Second lesson I've learned, and I'm offering to you, is I've had to learn that in the Bible there's more than one way to be an apostle. And now I recognise I might be using language that not everyone is comfortable with when I use the language apostle. What I mean is that in the Bible there's more than one way to lead and disciple and empower and release others. I thought there was only the 1 Corinthians 1:11 way. Imitate me as I imitate Christ. I was taught, pour yourself into other people, Alex. Help other people become like you. Say to people around you, imitate me because I'm imitating Christ. Some of you know that, some of you are nodding, yeah? I had to learn, and that's, by the way, that's a good model, nothing wrong with it. But I had to learn for multiplication, there's also the John 3:30 way. I must become less so you can become more. I must stand in the shadows so you can stand in the light. Literally in John 3, I will no longer be the groom. I will be the best man. So that actually you become the centre of attention, and my job is to sit at the end of the day exhausted on the steps, out of sight of everyone else, and thrilled with joy that you're being made much of. And there's a big difference between imitate me as I imitate Christ, which centralises us, puts us front and centre so people can see us to imitate us. Great for addition, terrible for multiplication, versus the mindset that says, I become less so you might become more. I step into the shadows so you can step into the light. And then the last thing I had to learn, sort of the hard way, and these are observations and inevitably were shaped by correctives needed for my personality, and you'll have different personalities. So they're thought experiments, they're offerings for you to digest, not assertively said. The third thing is multiplication needs you to understand the sphere in the ecosystem you're functioning in. What I mean by that is, the key to multiplication is collaboration, being able to work with others and give away things. But you need to know what sphere in the ecosystem that is to make sure you don't give away too little or give away too much. I'll illustrate it like this. If you're at the tactical ground level of planting a local church, week by week, day by day, month by month, you're going to live in each other's pockets, you're going to move forward together as a church, you need close collaboration. Yeah? You need agreement on theology, on practice, on where you're going to meet and when you're going to meet and how you're going to spend your money. And, yeah? You move into a room like this and it's strategic collaboration. You don't need to be bound to each other in the same way as if you're planting a local church. You need to be bound to each other now because you have a cause to invest in. You have a purpose. And you can do it on the ground in different ways, but you're going to help each other do, and so your bonds are less tight. Yeah? And then the top level, I'd say, is the environmental level. Southwark for Jesus. Yeah. Like, let's get MPs involved, and let's get businesses involved, and let's get anyone who's Southwark for Jesus involved. And your bonds need to be much less tight there for you to be able to collaborate. Yeah. What often goes wrong with multiplication is most of us have a primary experience of local church where the bonds have to be really tight, and we expect the same tightness as we move up. We expect the same agreement theologically or in practice, and therefore it becomes hard to collaborate. We can be nice to each other, but we can't work with each other. Well, that's because you're trying to be a local church where actually you're a network. In this room, you're a network. And so you see the difference. So they're my 3 offerings. They're not as crystal clear, worked up as they could have been, because I also wanted to worship right, you know. But I just thought that's what I've learned and observed in myself as I've tried to shift from someone able to do addition growth to someone who's trying to do multiplication growth, and the shift in my own posture. I'm going to hand back to the thing. Yeah.